The story you tell in the pilot episode of your TV show has to do a lot of work. It has to introduce the characters and the world, set up the rest of the show, and be so good it convinces the audience to keep watching. So, how do you write a great story for your pilot? Hi, I'm Micah Cratty. I'm a WJ screenwriter and the head of writing at Arc Studio. This is the fourth lesson in our How to Write a Great TV Pilot course. In our first two lessons, we covered developing a great idea for a TV show and creating compelling characters. Then in the third lesson, we covered some storytelling building blocks. You can find links to those lessons below. Today, we'll be drawing on those lessons to come up with the actual beats of your pilot story. In TV, we call that breaking the story. If you haven't, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on our future lessons. And stick around to the end for a pilot story worksheet that will help you apply this lesson. Now, come join me as we sing this opera of learning together, brought to you by Arc Studio and your imagination. Now, a lot of lessons on TV pilot stories will focus on act structure, and that's great, but I want to give some advice that will be useful no matter what kind of pilot you're writing, whether it's a half-hour sitcom or an hour-long drama. So instead of focusing on act structure, I'm going to talk about what you should do in the beginning of your story, in the middle of your story, and in the end of your story. But before we get lost in the weeds, I want to make sure you focus on the most important thing, telling a great story. Because yes, a pilot has to do a lot of work, but none of that really matters if the audience isn't enjoying it. So, have fun with it. Now let's start at the beginning with the beginning. The beginning of your pilot is incredibly important because it's like a representative sample of your entire pilot. And if you think about it, your pilot is like a representative sample of your entire show. So by the, I think, transitive property of mathematics, the beginning of your pilot is like a representative sample of your entire show. It's your show in miniature. And the beginning might be the only part of your pilot that an audience watches, or the only part of your pilot script that an executive reads. So you need to make it really good. No pressure. But don't worry, let me break down some tips for you for some great beginnings of a pilot. Don't explain too much at the beginning of your pilot story. Now, this can be really hard because you've been working so hard on this show, you've come up with the characters, the world, all this stuff, and you want to make sure the audience understands everything. Explaining too much is particularly tempting in genre shows that take place in a world that is different from ours, because you want to make sure the audience understands the rules, how the magic system works in your show, or the intergalactic government, whatever it is that you're creating. So maybe you're thinking of starting off your show with a scene where someone's explaining how all this stuff works so that, the audience has a firm footing moving forward. You don't need to do that. We can learn about the world as we go. Explaining too much slows your story down and makes the audience lose interest. And you really don't want to do that, especially at the beginning of your pilot when you're trying to get people interested. Only share the information the audience needs to know, and only share it when they need to know it. If you feel like you're explaining yourself too much and things are kind of slow, ask yourself if the audience needs to know this information to understand what the characters are going through right now. If not, the info can probably wait. When your audience starts watching your pilot, they're going to want to know what kind of show this is. Establishing the tone helps them understand the show and sets the audience's expectations moving forward. Establishing the tone also forces you to make the show compelling right away. If you're writing a comedy, you need to make the beginning funny. If you're writing a thriller, make the beginning thrilling. If it's a horror, make the beginning scary. Audiences and readers are impatient. They aren't going to wait around for the good stuff, so give it to them right away. Now, tone might seem like something to worry about once you're writing the script, not working on the story, but the story is where you come up with what scenes are going to be in your pilot. And those scenes are going to have a huge influence on establishing whatever the tone is. So it's good to think about at this stage as well. We can take the idea of making the story compelling right away a step further by hooking the audience. Hooking the audience means starting with something that's going to make the audience lean in and pay attention. There are many different ways of hooking the audience. One is to start out with a question or mystery that's going to be answered later in the episode. Another is to start off with a flash forward of the most exciting part of your pilot, and then the audience is going to stick around to see how we got there and how it turns out afterwards. Or, you can just make it really fun or funny. Just start your story with something that's going to make your audience think, whatever this is, I need more of it. We'll also meet your main characters pretty early. That could be in the first scene or pretty soon after that. Now, that may seem pretty obvious. They're your main characters, so of course you're going to meet them pretty quickly, but what might not be obvious is what they're doing when we meet them. It's helpful to meet them as they're doing something that tells us about who they are as a person. Have them solving a problem, reacting to a situation, making a decision, or taking some other kind of action that's revealing about who they are. But it's not just about what they're doing, it's about how they're doing it. Are they brilliant, fearless, deadly, lazy? Do they cheat? Do they lie? Do they put themselves at risk to save somebody else? Show us who they are. You can also use this moment or another moment early on to show what their core problem is. We talked about this a little in the lesson on developing characters. What's the fundamental disconnect between what your character wants and the reality of the world that they live in? This disconnect is going to be at the heart of your show. Pretty soon your pilot is going to change your protagonist's world. But before that happens, consider showing us what their normal is. What is their everyday life? What do they like about it? But also, what are they lacking? Because if your show is serialized, you're probably going to take that character on a journey where they reckon with whatever it is that they're lacking. Showing us what normal is helps us to understand what that journey is going to be and why it's necessary. If you've watched the previous lessons, you know that stories come from problems. The story of an episode is how your character or characters deals with a particular problem. So in the beginning of your pilot story, you need to introduce what the problem is that this episode is going to be about. But out of all the problems in all of the episodes of your show, the problem in your pilot episode is special, because the problem that you introduce in your pilot episode is the problem for the entire show. The thing in the pilot that starts the story for the entire show is called the inciting incident. The inciting incident is the reason your show is starting now. It sets your characters off on a path that is different than the path they were on before. And this new path, this is your show. Your character walking along this path is going to be your entire series. This ties into the character goals we talked about in Lesson 2. At the start of your pilot, or even before your pilot started, your character had an internal goal. Some sort of internal need, want, or desire that's been there the whole time, but they've been ignoring. And then when the inciting incident happens, it gives them an external goal. Something in the actual story that they're pursuing because of their internal goal. Their internal goal is motivating them to pursue their external goal. And your whole show is about how the quest for their external goal, or goals, because that can change over time, but how those external goals force them to reckon with their internal issues. In some shows, that reckoning will force them to change a little, and in some shows, that will force them to change a whole lot. So when should the inciting incident happen in your pilot story? Well, it can vary. In some shows, it could be on the first page. On other shows, it could be on page 10 or a little later. But in general, earlier is better than later. In fact, in some shows, the inciting incident happens even before the show starts. Like in Ted Lasso, you could say the inciting incident is Ted Lasso getting hired for the new job, and that actually happens before the pilot episode starts. But why is earlier better than later? Well, because your pilot episode demonstrates to the audience what your show actually is. But your show doesn't really become your show until after the inciting incident. Because remember, the inciting incident starts your characters off on this new path. And that new path is your show. So if you have too much of the old path, of the old world in your pilot, it's a little weird, because then suddenly your show becomes something else. So a little tip, if at all possible, move the inciting incident up. Don't wait to get to what your show really is. As a caveat, there are some shows that don't really have an inciting incident. Mad Men would be an example of this. Nothing really changes in the pilot significantly for Don Draper. He's already is who he is, and he's already doing what he's doing kind of before that pilot episode starts. But while he's not really changing that much, what is changing is the audience's understanding of who he is. So it is possible to have a pilot without an inciting incident, but it's pretty hard to pull off. We talked last lesson about A, B, and C stories. The A story is your protagonist's main storyline, and the B story is either a secondary storyline for them or the storyline of a secondary character. The C story would be a third storyline, which your pilot might not have. In the pilot, the A story is so important because the A story is what your show is, and you've got to get your show going. But the B story is also really important and shouldn't be overlooked because the B story adds depth either to your character or to the world of your show. I gave the example last lesson of a show where the A story is a detective pursuing a serial killer, and the B story is the detective's problems at home with his family. Now, the A story there is obviously important because it's a detective show. The show is about the detective finding the serial killer. But the B story is also really crucial because it's going to be how the audience connects with this character and where the emotional core of the story will lie. All that is to say, make sure the beginning of your pilot story has a beat or two of the B story. I'm not going to talk much about the B story moving forward, but you do need to make sure you keep that story moving and developing over the course of the rest of the episode. After the beginning of your story, you move into the middle of your story. The main problem of the episode has already been introduced in the beginning, and now in the middle, you escalate things. In short, the situation gets worse. That can happen because the problem gets worse or because of new problems, new complications are introduced. It's important that your character stays active here. They're not just having things done to them, they're doing things. They're taking actions and making decisions that have consequences. Remember how last lesson we were talking about but and therefore? Buts are complications in your story, and therefores are consequences of those complications. The inciting incident is a really big but. It's a really big complication, and your character will have had some sort of reaction to that complication. They've done something, made a decision, taken some action, something that is different from what they've normally done in their life. What you need after that are consequences to whatever the big decision was that your character made. And then based on those consequences, your character makes another decision, takes another action, which of course introduces new complications, new consequences, etc., and the story keeps developing and escalating. Remember, throughout this process, we're not just learning about the characters from what they're doing, but also how they're doing it. Don't be afraid to really put them in hot water, to really push them. You want them to feel unsettled, challenged, threatened, uncertain, whatever. Now, this won't apply in every case, but I think it's really good to have some sort of big development or twist in the middle of the pilot. Some big problem that changes things and launches us into the back half of the story. That big twist might lead to a low point or an all is lost moment for your character where it seems like there's no way out of this problem that they're in. And of course, that takes us to the ending. The ending of a pilot is just as important as the beginning, maybe even more important, because the ending has to leave the audience feeling satisfied while also wanting to watch more. Because remember, this is a TV show. You want them to want to watch the next episode. The ending usually includes the most intense, dramatic, or wacky part of the episode, the climax. It's the crisis, the moment where the character has to dig deep and solve or fail to solve this problem that they've probably created for themselves. It's really important that how they solve or fail to solve the problem comes from who they are and what their strengths and weaknesses are. I keep saying that characters reveal themselves through their actions, and since the climax is the biggest action of your episode, it's really important that your characters reveal who they are as they go through it. The climax also reveals what kind of show this is. Is it a show with big fun musical numbers? Is it a show with happy endings? Or is it a show where horrible things can happen? Whatever happens in the climax goes a long way in defining what the show is. I think it's also really important that the ending actually ends the story of the episode. Now, that might seem really obvious, it's the ending, but what I mean by that is that each episode should have a self-contained story. Whatever the story was in this episode, try to give it a satisfying conclusion. The trick is that while you're ending the story for this episode, you're also setting up the story for the rest of the show. You can think of this in terms of questions. You're answering one question in the story in your pilot, but then you're also asking another much larger question at the end of your pilot that is for your show moving forward. And the audience is going to want to keep watching because they're going to want to know the answer to that bigger question. You want the audience to be wondering what's next. And this is, of course, where TV differs from movies. With a movie, you want the audience to feel satisfied, they got what they paid for. But with the TV, you need them to feel satisfied and also wanting to know what's next. A TV pilot answers one question and asks another bigger question. Remember that it should be really clear by the end of your pilot what the new path is that your protagonist or protagonists are going to be on for the rest of your show. So how do you organize all this story information that you're coming up with as you figure out the beginning, middle, and end of your pilot? Well, one way you can do that is with a beat sheet. And a beat sheet is just what it sounds. It's a document with all your story beats on it. What beat sheets look like depends really on the writer. Some writers like very detailed beat sheets and others like them to be very spare with just the minimum information. For Arc Studio users, I put together a pilot story worksheet to help you do this. If you're not an Arc Studio user and you want access to the worksheet, you can sign up for free. You can access the worksheet in the link in the description below and then add it to your Arc Studio account. And from there, you can open the worksheet as a note template in any of your scripts. The worksheet recaps the major points of this lesson and gives you space to start figuring out the beats of your story. A lot of writers also like using index cards to help them figure out their story by putting each beat on a separate index card. This lets you see an overview of your story and rearrange the story structure by moving the cards around. This is something that the writers of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul have really become known for. They write all their beats on index cards, put those up on corkboards, and then use those boards as the basis for their outlines. You can also do this in Arc Studio with the Beats board, which uses digital index cards. Each card represents a beat in your story, so we call the cards beats. You give the beat a title and a synopsis of what happens in that beat. You can also tag the beats and color code them with the storylines they represent and with the characters that are in that beat. And this lets you filter the beats to see the ones that have the storylines or the characters that you want. The beats are arranged in columns called acts, and you can drag and drop them to rearrange your structure. Each beat also has a note attached to it, where you can brainstorm and store ideas and bits of dialogue you plan to use in that beat. I use notes so much in my writing. I love brainstorming in them and just having another place to write that isn't the script. The best part is that the beats are linked to your script. First, you can see all your beats and the synopses side by side with your script when you write for easy reference, and you can rearrange the scenes in your script by moving the beats. Okay, that's it for this lesson. Best of luck breaking the story in your pilot, and make sure to come back for the next lesson where we talk about actually writing the scenes in your script. Until then, be kind to yourselves and happy writing.